Hello, everyone. So, as per usual, I'll give people a couple of minutes to join in, and then I'll get started. So, my puppy has learned that when I'm talking to my computer screen, he can bug me and get away with a little bit more than usual. So, if you see him pop into the screen, um, working from home, it is what it is, right? So, this is T Rex. T Rex is almost a year old. All right, so today's session is going to be a little bit different than the last two and the next one. Today, I'm going to be talking about maybe some tough things to hear, but it is a part of our history and it is part of our ongoing struggles. And it needs to be talked about and heard and so, yeah, today I'm going to be talking about the hardships, the struggles that Inuit have faced here in Canada. So Inuit have always lived kind of like an isolated life, living up north in the Arctic. We live in some really, really harsh conditions, some harsh environments. And in the past, we hunted for our food. We still hunt for our food, and you'll find out why later on. So life in the Arctic is tough, and if you do some research and you look into our myths and our legends, they'll reflect how hard life is up north. The myths and legends don't always make sense to people in the south, but they made sense for us up north. So, like, one of them is when you're up north and you see the northern lights, you're never to whistle at them. They dance, they make sounds, but if they're too low and you whistle at them, they may take your head off and bring it up into the sky and play soccer with your skull. So, why would we tell kids such a story? Well, I haven't heard this from an elder or from other Inuit, but I kind of pieced things together. And like up north, sound travels, and the northern lights come out at night, and the polar bear also comes out at night. So, if you're standing in the middle of the tundra and you're whistling, you're now telling the polar bear exactly where you are. So that's one thing we told our kids: never, ever whistle at the northern lights. We have a creature up north who's called Mahaha, and he runs around and he tickles people to death. We have the Irak, which are the hide and seek creatures. What they'll do is they'll kind of show you some caribou off in the distance so you think you can go and hunt them, and there's lots of rolling hills in the tundra, so you go down and then you go up, and then the caribou will be somewhere else, and so you follow them that way, and then eventually you get lost, and that was the goal of the Iraq. Also, we have the Kalupiluk, which are creatures who live in the water right next to the ice edge. And the story goes, if you go down to the ice edge by yourself, a Kalupiluk will grab you and force you to live in their Mountie. They're old, ugly creatures, and that's because the ice edge is a dangerous place to be. It could fall, it crack and fall at any moment, and then you're in the cold, cold ocean. So a lot of our myths and legends kind of scare our children into safety up north in the harsh environment. I mean, we struggled to survive. We lived in small family groups of about 60 people. So you constantly lived with your family. And then at different times in the year, you would meet up with other families and share stories and where good hunting was, and trade information and different resources. Then Canada did the Europeans came over and formed Canada, and they brought Christianity with them. And they didn't teach it to us in a nice sort of way. So, one of the ways that they converted Inuit from the old ways into Christianity was by overhunting our food sources. And instead of sharing the food with us, they wouldn't allow you to eat the food that they had hunted, unless you denounced the old ways and you started to read the Bible, believe in the one God and Jesus Christ. So during this time, a lot of Inuit starved to death. They struggled to survive because the animals that we relied on were being overhunted with guns and by the missionaries and by the settlers. The So it was a really tough time to survive if you didn't want to switch to Christianity. And then with the Canadian government, they forced us to live in permanent locations, which is something that Inuit had never done. We were nomads. We always were traveling from spot to spot wherever the best hunting was. And the Canadian government forced us to live in permanent locations. So after tens of thousands of years of being nomads and knowing where the animals migrated, we now had to wait for the animals to come to us. So we had to relearn some hunting skills and different ways of hunting. So that was something new. And then there were the relocations. So Canada wanted to make sure that all of those beautiful northern islands belonged to Canada. So they had to be occupied by Canadians. So they knew that Inuit lived in northern Quebec and in Labrador and in Nunavut, and they thought we were all the same across the board. So what they did was they took families from different areas and sent them further up north. They're like, "Hey, you guys are Inuit. You can survive up north. You'll be all right." And they promised to bring supplies after they dropped off the families. Well, they didn't, and they also split families up. So they would drop off, like in one instance, they dropped off a mom, a child, and a dog on one island, and they dropped the dad off on the other island. And they took this family from northern Quebec and brought them up to the high central Arctic. Well, in northern Quebec, there are trees, there's different animals than there are up in Nunavut. But they dropped them off, expected them to survive, and they never returned with supplies. So there are a couple of statues up north of this family. The mom, the child, and the dog is in one community, and the dad statue is in another community. And across hundreds of kilometers, these statues are looking at each other. And that's in remembrance of these relocations that happened to many different families. Um, then there were residential schools that happened all across the north. My dad was sent to a residential school when he was younger, and it affected him for the rest of his life. Um, and so residential schools weren't really like they weren't a good thing. They took you from your community and they sent you somewhere else, so you were away from your family, you were away from your culture, and they wouldn't let you practice your culture, so you couldn't speak your language. The food wasn't the greatest. The children weren't treated the kindest. Even before Canada was settled, they took Inuit over to England and Europe and put them in like live museums, dressed up in all of our traditional clothes, which were made for the Arctic. And now here, these Inuit were in museums behind glass in their traditional clothing, which is way too hot for Europe and even indoors. Um, then we were also like um, a saying called the experimental Eskimo. Eskimo is not a word that we use in Canada anymore. It was created by the Northern Cree to describe Inuit, and in English it means eaters of raw meat. And we do eat uncooked meat. It's usually frozen or dried. Technically, not really raw because raw is squishy and bloody, but they used it to describe us. Aboriginal languages are very descriptive. So they saw us eating the meat uncooked and they called us Eskimos. But when the Europeans came over, when the settlers came over, they started to use that word Eskimo as a derogatory word. They used it to put us down. So we would rather be called by our own word for us, which is Inuit, and again, that means people. So I'm an Inuk because I'm only one. I'm one person. So INUK for one, INUUK, Inuk for two, and INUIT, Inuit for three or more of us. Um, so the experimental Eskimo, they would test like vitamin deficiency on us or new medications on us. We were used as guinea pigs. Human guinea pigs during times of residential schools. Then there were the dog slaughters. And when people hear me talk about these dog slaughters, they think that this happened way in the past, and how could anybody alive ever do this or go through this? Well, it happened like just a short time ago. So there were people in Canada who would go around the north, and they would kill our dogs. Without our dogs, we couldn't travel. It was harder to hunt. We couldn't go and see family. We couldn't share resources. So they wanted to make us reliant on the infrastructure of Canada. And so they would slaughter our dogs. And this happened to families while they were out hunting. So they weren't in their home communities. And then they had no way of returning home. Another thing that they did was they would see kayaks up on shore, and they would take their boat over to the kayaks, and then they would take out their knife and cut the kayaks. Traditional kayaks were built using sealskin and whalebone, so to repair them wasn't always the easiest, and it took a while. So they made sure that we couldn't travel. Now, when I say this happened a short time ago, I have a sister who, at the age of 7, had a dog shot, her own dog shot right in front of her when she was 7 years old in Labrador. So it's still very recent for us, and we're still trying to heal from all of these things that have happened to us. Another thing that you may or may not have heard about is and W numbers. So the Canadian government couldn't understand our naming practice, and Inuit didn't have last names until the settlers came over. And in the Inuit culture, names aren't necessarily just male or just female. Like if I tell you somebody's name Stephen, then you automatically assume that they're a male. And if I say Stephanie, then you automatically assume that they're a female. But up north, names switch genders because of our naming practice. We believe in reincarnation and we believe that your soul is attached to your name. So, like for instance, my dad passed in the year 2000, and his name was Sam. And my daughter was born in the year 2004, and I named her Sam after my dad. So now Inuit believe that they are one and the same person. My dad is in my daughter's body. So I have to treat her with the same respect and dignity that I would have given to my dad. Now, if we were living in a traditional Inuit community, the way that we used to live from birth until puberty, my daughter would have been taught everything that a boy would have been taught. And then after puberty, she would learn everything that a girl was taught. So names weren't gender based due to our naming practices and no last names. So the Canadian government wanted a way to identify us, a way that they could keep track of us. So they gave us metal tags. And for lack of a better name, we call them dog tags because that's exactly what they look like. On the front, there's a stamp of the Queen's crown issued by the Canadian government. And then on the back was an E number or a W number. E for East, W for West. And the number just identified who you were. And you had to carry this tag on you at all times. And if you couldn't produce this tag when you were asked for it by a government official, then you could get fined, you could get put in jail. There were repercussions to not having the tag on you. And so a lot of last names that Inuit have are first names. They're like the name of the father. At the time that we were given last names, it was like, what's your father's name? And then they gave that to you as your last name. And but what's really cool right now is for the next 2 years until January of 2022, some provinces, including the province of Ontario, have made it free for Indigenous people to change their names. You have to fit one of three criteria. So you have to be a residential school survivor, you have to be a direct descendant of a residential school survivor, or you have to have a cultural history of single name use only. So I didn't go to residential schools, but my dad did. So technically, I fit under Section 2. But the residential school that my dad went to has no record of him being there, which happened more often than not. So I can't. I couldn't do it under section number 2, so I went with single name use only. So legally, my name when I was born was Dion William Ephraim Metcalf. But now I have legally changed my name to Adla. And that's the only name I have. It's the only name that's on my identification, on my bank card, what have you. So it's pretty cool. Instead of having to pay, I think it's $137 plus HST, it was absolutely free to do that. And I would encourage more Indigenous people to do that. They also misspelled a lot of names. So, like, there's the last name Ilnik. We spell it Irniq, but if you hear it said, it sounds like there's an L. So a lot of names were misspelled. They didn't understand the way that our language works. So even if you want to keep your last name, you can get it changed to the proper spelling for free again until the year 2022. So that's kind of cool. And like I do these presentations in schools and I talk about the hardships, but I always like to end on positive notes. In the First Nations world, they have a saying that it takes 7 generations to heal from past traumas, and a generation is about 25 years. So that's 175 years to heal from past traumas. And you can see it happening now. My dad, the generation before me, was sent to residential schools. And so my generation wasn't really taught a lot about the culture. And that was the goal of residential schools. So my dad didn't teach me anything about being Inuit. I actually grew up Dutch. And when I was a teenager, I asked my dad how come he didn't teach us anything about the Inuit culture. And in my dad's own words, he said, "My son, I wanted to raise you guys westernized so that you could succeed down south." So, in my father's eyes, if he taught me anything about my culture, about my Inuit heritage, then I would grow up and become an unsuccessful person. But I needed to learn that in order to become a successful person. And I was lucky enough in Ottawa to have the Ottawa Inuit Children's Center, which is now called the Inuit Cultural Center, that I could send my children to. So my children have grown up with their culture. My daughter has been throat singing since she was 18 months old. She's now 16. She's performed, sorry, my dog. She's performed twice for Justin Trudeau at both of his swearing in ceremonies. She's performed at the Calgary Stampede for 10 nights in a row, for 22,000 people a night, standing next to Jan Arden. They were the headliners of the American Folk Festival down in Bangor, Maine. So even though my daughter was born and raised in Ottawa, she still had that cultural component from birth, thanks to the Inuit Cultural Center. And what we find now, or what I find now, is that that generation, the generation after mine, these youth who are growing up with their culture, with the knowledge of their ancestors, they are the strongest generation of Inuit and indigenous youth that we have seen in a really, really long time since Canada was formed. So it's absolutely fantastic to see these youth standing up for their culture, speaking out about their culture, standing up for the land and the water, and indigenous rights. And they're doing it in their own way. So I know one youth who writes poems, like spoken word things. My daughter throat sings. My son drums and teaches Inuit games. Then we have artists like Northern Knowledge, like Jay Breton. And First Nations, there's Cody Coyote, Jakota. Back to Inuit, there's Kelly Fraser, who the late great Kelly Fraser, who was like a pop artist who sang in Inuktitut and in English. There's the Jerry Cans. There's Sela and Rise. Who are absolutely fantastic throat singers who mix throat singing with new electric music or electronic music. And what's great is that my children have grown up around their idols. So, like when I was growing up, there was no Inuk that I could point to and say, when I grow up, I want to be like that person. And then here my daughter is babysitting for her throat singing idol and learning from her and learning new sounds and getting to practice throat singing with her throat singing idol. And then my son and my daughter and I got to perform on Canada Day with Jakota. And it's just absolutely amazing to see where growing up, one of my sisters would tell people that she was Chinese instead of admitting that she was Inuk, because then there were a lot less questions, there was a lot less teasing. And now, when I do presentations in schools, I have children come up to me and tell me that they wish they could be Inuk. And so, like, it's changed, but there's still a long way to go. My daughter still gets made fun of in school and in class for being Inuit. She gets made fun of for standing up for Indigenous rights and for teaching Indigenous knowledge in classes. There are still teachers that don't understand the way Indigenous families are, and some of them aren't very open to being taught from an Indigenous person. For the most part, teachers are excellent. They love to hear it. They love my presentations, and they love to hear from my daughter. But there's still a few that are stuck in the old ways and don't really want to be told what they're teaching is wrong. There was one instance where I was presenting at a school in Quebec, and the teacher got all excited, and she's like, "Look, I got my students to write their names in Inuktitut and in syllabics." And I started to read the names, and none of them were making sense to me whatsoever. And so I asked her to show me like where she learned, and she went and got this huge, thick binder that she had been given by her school's school board, and she flipped over to the page, and what the school board had given her was this sheet with A equals this symbol, B equals that symbol, C equals such and such symbol, and so on and so forth. Every single letter of the English alphabet was given one particular symbol that we use in our language. And that's just not the way that our language works. Each symbol in our written language actually represents a sound rather than a single letter. So we have one that looks kind of like an igloo, a hump, and then a straight line, and that represents our. Well, it depends on which way you orient it, but it could be R-A, R-I, or R-U, ri, ru, ra. And so each symbol represents a sound. And so in the English alphabet, you have 26 letters, five, sometimes six vowels. And in Inuktitut, we have 60 different symbols that represent the sounds that we make in our language. So, I mean, it was great that she was so enthusiastic about teaching the culture and about teaching the written format of our language, and she didn't know that what she was teaching was wrong because it came down from the school board. So even though we've come a long way from when I was a child, we still have leaps and bounds to go. And so, like I'm always very thankful that places like the Indigenous Sports and Wellness of Ontario have me come in and speak about the Inuit culture. I'm grateful to the school boards of Ottawa who are allowing me to come into their schools and teach the children from a firsthand experience about the Inuit culture. And things are starting to change. When I first entered schools about 5 years ago, most children in Ottawa still believe that Inuit lived in igloos, which we haven't for many, many years. They still question about what kind of things that we have up north. And I mean, we live in a modern day, a modern age. So everything that's down here is basically up north, just not as much. And like most small communities won't have fast food restaurants, but they do have a restaurant and a grocery store and a hotel. So yeah, tune in next week. Make sure that you're wearing comfortable clothing because we're actually going to demonstrate and teach you some traditional Inuit games that can be played with social distancing. There aren't that many that can be done with social distancing. Inuit games, you got to be in close contact with your person that you're playing against, but there are a few that I can teach you. So again, tune in next week. Wear nice, comfortable clothing. And I'm sorry that we had to talk about some harsh truths about Inuit culture and where we've come, but it's great to know that where we're headed is in the right direction. So thank you once again for tuning in today, and please join me again next week when we do something that's a lot more fun. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a good day.